Hey everyone. Today I wanted to talk about a philosophical idea called utilitarianism. So, utilitarianism is kind of the belief that the purpose of life is to get as much pleasure as possible and to avoid as much pain as possible. A Greek philosopher named Epicurus, who basically believed that this was the purpose of human existence. There was also, I believe his name is Jeremy Bentham. I can never remember his first name, but he was a philosopher in Europe who I believe coined the actual term utilitarianism. And he defined moral virtue kind of like this, right? He had this beautiful image that there were two chains to the throne of pain and pleasure that like all of human society was tied to. And I think on some intuitive level, utilitarianism makes a ton of sense, right? Like pain is obviously bad and obviously we don't like it. And pleasure is like kind of obviously good. And most of the critiques that people have of utilitarianism, right, tend to actually just concede the basic premise to the utilitarian. So if someone was trying to argue why, for example, you might not want to do drugs, there's a temptation to argue that like the reason you shouldn't do drugs is because it will make you sad in the future, right? So if I do heroin now, I'm going to get really addicted to heroin and it's going to get in the way of me doing pleasure seeking things. But someone like Epicurus's argument to that is that you're thinking about pleasure in kind of like a short term sense, right? And that really you should be seeking like these longer term pleasures. So then someone might say, well, look, there's more to life than just like, you know, gooning all the time. And someone like Epicurus would go, well, like, oh, but there are different kinds of pleasure, right? And there are higher and lower pleasures. But I think to me, the whole premise of pain and pleasure being the purpose is kind of like putting the cart before the horse, in the sense that we're kind of losing track of what pain and pleasure actually are, right? So I wanted to really think about it, right? Like, what is pain and pleasure? Because I would argue that they're a stimuli and response system, right? So humans are this adapted social organism that that is that is constantly trying to just like survive in a world of Darwinian struggle. And the last maybe couple of thousand years of human existence have been one of relaxed Darwinian pressure, at least somewhat. But that pressure like still exists, right, on some basic level. And the problem is that there aren't Darwin points laying around, right? So I don't know what behavior is going to increase my long-term like vitality, right? But like there's something out there that will, right? So for example, like if I go into a fire and I stand in it, that almost certainly will mean I will have fewer kids going forward than if I didn't go and stand in a fire. And so our body evolves this stimuli and response system that basically approximates whether we think something is Darwinianly good or Darwinianly bad for ourselves. So fire causes us pain and sex causes us pleasure, right? But these are approximations at the end of the day, and they're pretty like noisy and lagged approximations. You can just think to yourself of modern society, right? That fast food is very pleasurable because in a certain setting that we humans evolved under, things like fat and sugar were Darwinianly very good, and if you could find them, you should consume them. But in the modern world, that seems like less intuitively true. And in fact, butter and sugar are two things that I personally consume more of, and my doctor tells me to consume less. And so there's this like kind of idea that it shouldn't just be about the pain and pleasure response, right? And if it is, you start to get yourselves in some kind of like weird circumstances where either you say, well, like it isn't actually the stimuli response, it's not like the pain and system, it's, there's something outside of the pain system. And then we would agree with each other. Or you end up in these scenarios where like the highest ethical good, if you're utilitarian, would be to like hook people up to the matrix, right? Or I have a friend in my PhD program who I think in jest told me that he would stop being a vegetarian if he could hook thousands of rats up to heroin forever, because then like his utility would be positive in the world. And I just think that like if we traveled into the future and saw billions of humans hooked to heroin machines, we would think that this is horrifying, right? And it's because that there's like this broader construct, right? So to steal Jeremy Bentham's language, like if you think of pain and pleasure as like the throne to which all morality is, there's this throne room around it of Darwinian fitness. And that utilitarianism is like assigning perpetual moral privilege to the slice of the approximation functions that life has of that Darwinian optimization problem, right? And I guess I just don't think that that's like objectively correct. I mean, you can argue, and I think it's a reasonable case that you can argue that like minimizing the loss function of your estimator is good. It's probably like the best thing that you can do, and that in most circumstances you would be pretty well served by doing the things that are going to bring you long-term pleasure. But that doesn't mean that like they're always right, or that things that cause you pain are always wrong. So like an example that I can think of is like the death of Boromir, right, in Lord of the Rings. This is like one of the most beautiful and badass scenes in all of modern movie history. And it's not because I think that like Boromir was doing some like utility maximizing thing for other people, and that, you know, he assigned certain weight functions to the residents of his realm, and so then he was experiencing intense pleasure in the moment of death. Like, no, like it's badass because he sacrifices himself for his friends, right? And I guess it's you can get into these mental word games with utilitarians where they can kind of like justify any individual act of heroism through this utilitarian sense. But I think it's just simpler to accept that like sometimes things that bring you pain are actually good, and that sometimes things that bring you pleasure are actually bad. And that something could bring everyone a huge amount of pleasure, and that wouldn't make it good. And that things can cause everyone a huge amount of pain, and that doesn't make it bad. But that there's something else, right? Like there's the preservation and continuation of consciousness that to me is a more profound judge of goodness and badness. Anyway, peace.